Hello. Today I'm here to give a brief update on a talk I gave a few years ago at TAFAC, hopefully with some exciting new information and additions to what has already turned out to be a fairly amazing site. Between 2019 and 2023, AOC have conducted evaluations and excavations on half of DG Leng for a mixed industrial and housing development site at the land at Piskelly, Upper Victoria in Carnoustie. What's been revealed is a substantial multi-period settlement site with activity stretching from the Neolithic through to the early historic and modern era. Carnoustie sits in a rich archaeological landscape, and at the time of the first excavation, the site was surrounded by 6 scheduled monuments, including 2 unenclosed prehistoric settlement sites, one of which is now descheduled, an enclosed settlement, ring barrow, and others. East of the development, Guard Archaeology encountered the remains of a Neolithic timber hall and Bronze Age hoard. In 2019, a large excavation area of nearly 40,000 square metres was opened, revealing a swathe of features from multiple periods from Neolithic onwards. As can be seen on the plan on screen, there's a large spread of pits and linears. Some of this will be general background activity, others are known structures and later agricultural activity. I'm not going to dwell on it too long because there's a lot on the site and there's more exciting things to be talking about. However, one of the earliest dated features on the site was a large pit producing a Neolithic carbonated bowl. 16 sherds were recovered, representing a substantial portion of an incomplete early bowl. Several rejoins, suggesting 1/3 of the circumference of the pot was present. Use was present with sooting and some carbonised residue on the surface, possibly from food remains. It even shows some signs of repair. These bowls are characteristic of the first half of the 4th millennium BC in Britain. However, oak charcoal from a fill associated with it has returned surprisingly early date of the 6th millennium BC, suggesting that old wood was perhaps utilised during firing. One of the first features encountered during the evaluation stage was a clear enclosure ditch to the north of the site. Enclosure 1 was suboval, measured 25 by 19 metres, and comprised of 3 separate ditches. Several pits were within the ditches, however, no obvious structure was represented. Charcoal, hazel, and birch samples returned dates placing the enclosure in the 1st century AD, and it's likely some sort of Iron Age stock enclosure. And the final stop on this brief tour is structures 2 and 3 in the middle of the site. These are both sub-rectangular buildings, one with a small annex attached. Structure 2 was 45 metres in length, while structure 3 was only 16. And they were both about 7 to 8 metres wide. No artefacts were recovered from either. However, charcoal, heather, and hazel has returned dates placing both structures between 235 and 383 AD. This dating, along with the general shape, suggests them to be in the pit Karmic style structure group. These structures generally date to within the 1st millennium AD and exhibit the same sub-rectangular pattern and have similar dimensions to those at Carnoustie. Internal hearths have also been noted, with byre annexes such as structures 2 and 3 here. So during excavation works, the initial 2 kists were identified. However, the work progressed, more large pits weathered out to reveal more. A total of 8 kists with varying degrees of preservation were identified on the northern half of the site, aligned southwest to the northeast. They were not bound in any formal enclosure and seemed to follow the ridge of a slight rise within the landscape. Kist 1 was located along the western edge of the site and is constructed of large sub-rounded boulders with corbelled angular flat stones. At an internal dimension of 1.5 by half a metre and is about half a metre in depth. No capstone was present and the kist itself was completely infilled with sand. Due to us not having a capstone at the time, it was difficult to suggest whether it was purposely infilled or a result of later event. The remains were poorly preserved, however the remains were thought to have been crouched with the head laying to the south facing north and the legs on the left. Unfortunately, no torso or pelvis remained. Due to the poor preservation, the individual can only said to have been a non-adult, under 18 years old, likely the older juvenile or adolescent based on the long bones. Weirdly present behind the individual was a small deposit of disarticulated teeth, including 9 cusps. The presence of one of the cusps from tooth 18 suggests that the teeth belonged to someone of at least age 12. However, for the most part, the teeth were poor condition with What can be said about them? The assessment has suggested that the teeth originate from one individual. It cannot be ruled out that they belong to the interred individual, despite being in a non-traditional location. Radiocarbon dating from Kiss 1 from a long bone has suggested that the date is to be 2121 to 1898 calibrated BC. Unfortunately, no dates were able to be taken from the cusps. Kiss 2 further along was unfortunately a little bit disappointing. There was only a small portion of capstone remaining and nice schist slabs encapsulating it. However, the remains recovered were spread about, fairly disarticulated, though they do seem to have be primarily the remains of a non-adult and adult of unknown age and biological sex, with cervical vertebrae, right shoulder, pelvis, and fragments of both femora recovered. Kiss 3 was located by itself, initially looking to be enclosed in structure 2, however, were never interpreted as being contemporary, and radiocarbon dates now support that. The kiss was located within a deep pit measuring 2.2 metres by 1.88 and by about 1.2 metre depth, filled with a gravelly sand. It was capped with 2 large flat slabs with no inscription or markings, unfortunately. The remains of a single individual were recorded in here with no associated grave goods. The individual was poorly preserved with only the fragments of lower limbs, skull, and cervical vertebrae present. Based on positioning, we know that they were laid on the right side with the back and head slightly tilted upwards. The individual was possibly male with an age of death between 25 and 45 years, though this is tentative at best. Radiocarbon dates returned 2136 to 1952 calibrated BC. Unfortunately, due to poor preservation, pathology has been difficult. However, evidence suggests that they likely suffered anemia or B12 deficiency, as well as extensive dental wear, not unusual for the time. Our fourth kist was continuing the theme of large, deep pits, incredibly difficult to see at time of excavation. The pit itself measured 2 metres by about 1.25 metres in depth and was filled with a stone-rich deposit, perhaps covered by a cairn at some point. The kist structure was red sandstone, similar to the area, with large rounded beach stone used at the southwest with a base of natural sand. The kist itself was also filled with sand, suggesting it was probably a purposeful deposit. Kist 4 contained the remains of a single individual laid to rest on the right side in a crouched position. The legs were tightly flexed up into their torso, with the individual appearing to tightly cradle a large vessel against their chest, the left arm flexed between the knees and the vessel, the right side of the face resting against the side of the vessel as well. The remains were that of an adult male, possibly over the age of 45 years, with radiocarbon dates placed in 2135 to 1936 calibrated BC. The remains were in poor condition, with the skull particularly fragile, with most of the outer table missing, making identification of pathology difficult, while the teeth were similar condition. It's possible to identify ante-mortem tooth loss, dental enamel hypoplasia, and calculus. Loose teeth were also recovered from the base of the fill of the kist, while most were able to be attributed to the interred individual. There were several to likely represented a second individual. This includes lower right first premolar and would suggest the individual younger than 45 years of age. A lower left second molar was also recovered again, with only slight wear to the surface, suggesting a younger individual. A reasonably sized fuse vessel was also recovered, with decoration on its upper part with a random maggot, it's called impression, made by pressing a length of whipped cord into the clay. 2 fusiform beads were also recovered. The beads were likely to have started their use life as components of a spacer plate necklace, of which several examples exist in Tayside and Fife. These will have been prestigious items of high status female jewellery, and their value is reflected in the fact that the burial of the individual beads, or smaller numbers of beads of such necklaces, were attested during the early Bronze Age. Kist 5, one of the more exciting ones, and one that you always hope when you start becoming an archaeologist. This is part of a smaller cluster of burials along with Kist 6 and 8, and some cremation pits. It was again located in a large, deep pit with a capstone of large sandstone slab resting on green sandstone schist uprights, forming a rectangular shape. It was completely void of fill, and the flooring consisted of tightly packed quartz pebbles. 3 individuals were laying within Kist 5, articulated remains, disarticulated deposit, and deposit of cremated remains. It suggested that the primary burial was the articulated remains of a young to middle adult. The individual appears to have been buried covered in oxide or fabric shroud with a beaker vessel, both of which are depicted on the screen there. The slightly weird brown mess is a in situ fabric with what looks to be a nice sort of tartan-esque plaid weave. But we're still getting that analysed at the minute. So the skull was located at the northeast end of the kist and was positioned on the left side, with the top of the skull facing the body and the facial bones towards the beaker vessel. The skull could have rolled over during decomposition, however, if that had been the case, it would have likely been located further away from the body. In addition, the remains of the textile are evident on the frontal right side of the skull, suggesting that this side was upright during original burial. This would suggest that the skull had been originally positioned with the face directed away from the vessel and the arms found in articulation with the shoulder slightly raised towards the head and the arm slightly flexed, with left elbow positioned tightly to the northern wall of the kist. The cremated remains and disarticulated deposit were placed over the articulated remains. However, it's unknown, based on the placement of these, which was first, or if they were both simultaneous events. The cremated remains were located to the southeastern side of the kist, slightly on top of the right tibia and distal end of the right femur, including more textile. The deposit of the disarticulated remains was located in the southern corner, with the fragments positioned on top of the articulated remains. Initial results would appear to suggest that the cremation deposit was that deposited after the disarticulated remains at this point. The remains represent that of a single individual, an older juvenile, circa 6.5 years old. There's no evidence of articulation, and only 25% of the skeletal remains are present. This is likely the secondary burial for these sets of remains. Alternatively, though, the nature of the remains could reflect body reduction, where the remains have been removed and regrouped within the kist and some taken out. The latter is more likely, as there was quite a bit of fragmentation. This could at least be in part though caused by the collection movement and redisposition of the skeletal remains. Dates returned from the cremated remains, 2456 to 2209 calibrated BC, and the inhumation 2401 to 2151 calibrated BC, would certainly suggest that order of interment may be more complicated than first appears. While there is overlap, it may suggest that the cremated remains occurred first and were curated at a time before interment within the kist. A slender, long-necked beaker, whose neck splays slightly, with a very low cordon on the neck belly junction, was recovered as well. The rim was gently squared off, and the pot is the widest point, high on the belly. The interior of the base was slightly domed, while the exterior is minimally dished. All features regularly seen on beakers of this type. The pot had been carefully and skillfully made, and there were scrape mark facets on the interior where it had been scraped to thin the walls. The surface has been carefully smooth and have slip-like appearance. Either a thin slip was applied, or else the pot had been well smoothed. There was also a small bone toggle from this kist, however it was quite delicate in state, but we also found a secondary one in the next kist, where I'll be able to show you a nicer picture. So unsurprisingly, kist 6 next. Again, within a large pit, this time a metre deep. In the kist capstone consisting of a large red sandstone slab similar to kist 5. However, the capstone was slightly smaller than the kist width, residing in some sand infill from a later date. It consisted of skeletal fragments positioned at the top of a large quartz pebble floor with remnants of textile. Again, during excavation, we believed that the kist contained the remains of 2 crouched individuals, each located at opposite ends. However, analysis has suggested that this is only the partial remains and were disarticulated and tightly bound sequence. The sequence is difficult to interpret. Both sets of disarticulated remains would suggest they had either been deposited within the kist after their primary burial at another location, or the remains were moved within the kist after full decomposition. The presence of what appears to be articulated lower limbs in the centre of the kist questions both these possibilities, however. Why would the upper body have been moved and clustered together? It could be that during interment of a set of disarticulated remains, the upper torso of another were removed, with the plan being secondary burial in place of the northeastern end. It could be then that not enough space was available, so they then placed the rest at the feet of the other set of remains at the south. A beaker was recovered from Kist 6, however it completely disintegrated and now exists of just hundreds of friable small shards, many of which are spalls. This fabric confirms the radiocarbon dates as being to the Chalcolithic period, however. And the bone toggle, as seen on screen there, was recovered from the lower set of remains and confirms the assessment at the time that the individual was likely male. The object consists of a small, short cylindrical ring produced from a segment of hollow shaft of a mammal bone. The entire external surface and ends of the ring have been shaped and modified, but the interior curvature of the ring is probably reflective of the original natural character of the bone. The ends have been flattened and smoothed and decorated to form a fine radial lines when incised around the rim circumference. At the time, I kept referring it to like a toggle, but I keep getting told off for that because they're not scouts, so it's more like a bone belt. But I still prefer toggle. It's more fun to say. No, woggle, sorry. Woggle is what I kept saying it. Anyway. So one of my favourite kists is Kiss 7. Contained the remains of a single individual. The individual was found positioned on their left side, with the head to the south, and the legs tightly flexed, feet tucked under. The right arm was flexed over the torso and positioned over a tightly flexed left arm. The skull was resting on the left side with his chin propped up against their left shoulder. The legs were tightly flexed on the left side. Remains were identified as belonging to a middle to mature adult male. Slight degenerative joint disease present throughout the vertebral column, with calculus affecting the dentition. The dentition also showed evidence of activity of induced dental modification. The individual had also been the victim of a sharp force trauma to the head, but survived the incident. Found with the remains was a copper-based knife, a squat ogival form with triangular blade and a high rounded butt, tapering down to the length of a narrow but damaged point. The butt is perforated in 3 places towards both edges. The base of the butt is slightly off-centre at the apex. Copper-based rivets with flattened sub-rectangular heads survived in the 2 outer positions. The central rivet was missing. A distinct linear tie line is visible on the surface of the blade below the outermost rivets, indicating the extent to which the hilt of the knife would have extended. And at the time, there was organic remains associated with the blade that consisted of a mass of dark brown materials. They appear at first glance to be amorphous, but further analysis will allow more to be said about these at the time. However, assessment has determined it to be degraded horn and likely represents the remains of the hilt, whilst a darker brown material around it is probably an animal skin hide and is likely to be part of the sheath. And if you're bored of Kist now, this is the last one. Kist 8 was within, and you'll have guessed it, another large pit. Not as deep as any of the other ones, though. The kist consisted of 4 large upright slabs capped with a broken sandstone schist, resulting in a large quantity of fill within the kist. The kist contained the remains of a single individual interred with a ceramic beaker placed behind their lower back. The burial represents the remains of an adult female over the age of 18 years old, placed in a crouched position with the head positioned on the right side and arms flexed at the right angle. The head and the hands would have been just above the knees. The skeletal remains were in poor condition, making identification of any pathology difficult, apart from the presence of slight dental calculus. And the age of death has not been possible. There's still a lot more work to be done with these. We're just finished off the assessment stage and moving into the analysis stage. We're hoping to do more and finding out if these were family groups, incomers, or native to the Angus region. But as I say, post-ex work is still ongoing, and hopefully we can start answering more through ancient DNA and whatnot. But this site is the gift that just keeps on giving and winding our client up, unfortunately. When in 2022 and 2023 we returned to continue more works associated with industrial estate. The initial evaluation revealed a single souterrain. However, as stripping continued, and as the way of these things, we found at least one more. Souterrain 1 is the feature identified in the valuation and was the focus of the initial topsoil strip. I should have put it in here. You can actually see that just about every trench that we had missed the other souterrain by like a pebble, basically. And it was the same with the Kess. I missed every single one during the valuation, and it was about a metre off every single one of them. So it was souterrain 1 at the top there was the initial reason why we were there. It was broadly rectilinear and narrowed towards the southwards to create the south-facing entrance. Fairly typical in plan, if slightly irregular. It had total dimensions of about 15 metres with a width of 2.9 to 3.1 and depths of up to 0.9. The fill throughout souterrain 1 was remarkably consistent and suggests it was purposely infilled. The structural elements comprised of flagstone floor with stone walls. The flagstone floor covered the entire base of the structure, and where the stratigraphic relationship to the side of the walls could be clearly distinguished, it was clear that the walls were constructed in advance of the flooring going in. Flagstone floor comprised of a mix of stone types, with predominantly flat stones used throughout, and a few are more rounded with a mix of sizes. There's also a number of smaller stones rammed between the flagstones and used to fill gaps between much of the larger of them. There's evidence of some of the flagstones missing as well. At the entrance of souterrain 1 on the northern side of the structure, adjacent to the wall, where it was set on the floor, was a door pivot stone. It is viewed as being in situ and marking the position of an internal entrance door within the wall opposite side of the structure. Sorry, I should have changed to that. On removal of the floor, two of the stones within the floor had seemed to have also been worked at some point. Sorry, I've missed a few slides on my thing to change everything. So, souterrain 2, the souterrain that shouldn't have been there, was uncovered during machine stripping of the first one. It lay on the southwest of souterrain 1 with about 7 metres apart. Both souterrains share a similar orientation, aligned east to west, with the entrance of both structures lying to the eastern end of their respective feature. However, the two souterrains are quite different in many other aspects. Souterrain 2 in plan was noticeably curved in style, with an entrance lying to the southeast and a larger of the two examples. And unlike souterrain 1, there was a side chamber. It was comprised of 3 distinct elements: the entrance passage, the main chamber, and the side passage. It measured 20 metres long and a narrow entrance widening to 3.65 metres, with the greatest depth being about 95 centimetres. The main fill was similarly homogeneous to the first souterrain throughout the structure and indicative of a deliberate and single episode of backfilling. It contained animal bone, sunburn. Some coarse stone artefacts were also recovered, including a pivot stone, mortar, rubbing stone, quern fragment, and spindle whorl. The flagstones within souterrain too were particularly well laid and provided an extremely flat and usable floor surface. The stones utilised within the flagstone surface were almost entirely thin red sandstone slabs across the western end of the structure, giving way to a wider array of stone types, including more flat water-wash stones, like those commonly within the first one. The walls, as in souterrain 1, would have appeared to predate the flagstone floor, as well as being built a very similar construction method, large foundation stones, with smaller stones for the upper courses. The western end of souterrain 2 primarily consisted of just the large foundation stones. These were often large boulders up to 1.2 metres in size, which had been positioned and set into the subsoil in a manner to have been their flattest faces and aspects as the internal wall face. Moving eastwards into the natural slope, the upper course survived to a greater extent, and through to the entrance of the souterrain, there were up to 5 courses surviving in places. It's notable that towards the door checks and the internal floor, the wall coursing does suggest it possibly started to corbel at this point. The entrance of souterrain 2 was much more extant and considerably more elaborate, incorporating many elements typically found within other souterrain sites. The passage extends for a length of 4 metres, though the entrance would have undoubtedly continued further, but has been truncated. There was a clear step down to the southwest end of the entrance, marked by an edge-set stone, where the remainder of the entrance passage relatively level, and the same approximate level as the main chamber. At the end of the entrance passage, there was an edge-set stones demarcating the entrance passage from the main chamber, and a door check on either side, marked with orthostats. The floor of the souterrain was an impressively large threshold stone. Immediately inside the door check, to the northern side of the doorway, was a door pivot stone in the set into the floor, which was a repurposed rotary quern. On the south side of this souterrain, there was a clear break in the southern wall, which was marked on the east side with an orthostat. In the west appears to be a similar orthostat had fallen over. The presence of the 2 orthostats suggests there was a break in the wall line was deliberate and given to a side entrance, aligned with a large round-ended rectilinear cut that would have been safe to interpret as a side annex. 1 minute. Right, I'll move on to the... We're nearly done anyway, it's fine. So one of the weirdest features that was uncovered was a possible proto-souterrain. It was a large cut within the... that went underneath souterrain 2 and revealed on either side of it. The base of the feature and sides remained vertical and appeared to have a shelf on the eastern side of a cut, and the upper feature widened, creating a large platform. Basic slots curved around the shelf, creating a short annex about 1.2 metres long, and was aligned east-west. Basically, it was another really weird, strange feature. You can see on the initial aerial photography that it just snakes around, and you almost miss it initially until further cleaning revealed it. And you can see in the picture at the top right there, the depression where the floor of souterrain 2 had started sunk into. Works are still ongoing with these souterrains. They were found fairly recently, but it's further adds to a large multi-period settlement site at Pitskelly Farm, and hopefully we'll be back in another year or two to bore you further with more interesting information. So, thank you very much.